In our initial Corpus Christi show, or it may have been episode 2, Father Richard asked me this question: if I could invite 3 people to dinner, who would I invite? For some reason, those kind of questions just, they throw me. But anyways, I spit out the answer. He told me, but I went back and looked just to see actually what I had said. And yes, it was my mother, St. Josemaria Escriva, and Thomas Aquinas. And then I wondered if I would get a word in edgewise, because my mother would be asking them all the questions about religion. And I would have to say, my chopped liver or something. So now the young ones don't know what that expression means, but it's like, hey, what's the matter with your son who's a priest? But I'd have these great saints there, and my mother would just be peppering them with questions, as she does with people she just met. As I was reading the beginning of this Sunday's gospel, the idea of invitation came to mind. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. Jesus, as we know, will go on to tell one of his most memorable parables, the 3, but of the 3, the one parable stands out. It has influenced millions of people down through the centuries, and perhaps even whole cultures. The parable of the prodigal son, or even better, the prodigal sons. Because remember who he's telling the parable to. It's not the wayward, so-called wayward, it's the hardened hearts of the Pharisees. He's talking to the Pharisees and the scribes. That's important to keep in mind. Jesus welcoming and eating with sinners. Remember, sinners are not people necessarily who have committed a grave sin, like in the Catholic context of missing Mass on purpose, that kind of stuff. But sinners in the time of Jesus were people in a class or a group who were committing grave offenses against God and his people in an ongoing, sort of repeated kind of way. Classic example is the tax collectors. It wasn't just a one-off, but it was an ongoing profession of theirs. They were Jews collaborating with the Romans and ripping off the Jewish people. So they were hated, like really despised by their own people. They were in a class or a group of sinners, okay? So he's eating with sinners, like how dare he eat with tax collectors and, even prostitutes. It's important to ask yourself if you would be shocked if you saw Jesus today eat with riffraff, what we call riffraff, or sinners, people who are not very nice. Would you, would I react like the Pharisees? And so as not to think too quickly about how we would respond from the safety of your pews or my pulpit or your recliners at home, think about how you would respond if the Pope met people of questionable moral character in our own time. The President of the Russian Federation. He welcomes in, he sits down and has supper with him. The cameras are not there. Or an atheist who's not just an atheist, but an atheist who's anti-Catholic and who's successfully leading people out of the church. Or perhaps even worse, a very quote-unquote successful pro-abortionist who's actually kind of a focus point for the pro-abortion movement in any country. Pope has that person in, sits down for supper with them. People were somewhat shocked when John Paul II welcomed Fidel Castro to the Vatican, and then about a year later, he went to Cuba. Fidel Castro was not just a dictator, but he was a brutal dictator. He saw the death of a lot of people. Who would you invite to dinner? Would you be scandalized at who Jesus would sit down with? We can have reactions about inviting people to dinner, sometimes who don't fit the bill, so to speak, or our expectations. I'm not sure how I would answer the question today that was posed by Father Richard a couple years ago, back in 2020, especially if I was responding in the light of the Alpha invite. I wonder who Jesus would invite, and they didn't know it was Jesus. I wonder who Jesus would invite to Alpha. Would it be Matthew? Now, Matthew seems to be a nonviolent person. And I say that because the tax collectors were not nice people, or people who did very not nice things, so to speak. The whole profession fed their personality. So they were just not nice people to be around. They were hardened, they could be mean, aloof, perhaps even suspect violent, because they knew everybody hated them and probably wanted to kill them. So that develops a certain kind of personality. But Jesus invites Matthew, and you think, well, no, I know what Matthew's like. He goes on to become a saint and writes a gospel. But all the other 11, no. Why would you invite somebody like that? This really comes out in The Chosen. And I think that's probably true to life. Why would all these Jews want this creep in their company? Why would Jesus do this? Jesus basically says, get used to change. I invited you, Peter. You don't know what you're going to do yet. You're going to deny me 3 times, but I'm not telling you that. You never know the impact that an invite can have on someone's life. I viewed Steve Harvey clip on Facebook. I kind of like Steve Harvey. He's got some very interesting things. He was interviewing a 20-year-old African-American man. This fellow had lost his job, and so he just blasted out a bunch of applications, got no responses, and eventually a moving company offered him a job. For many reasons, though, he could not get to work the next day, which was 20 miles from where he lived. And so he said, well, I have 2 legs and 2 feet, so he decided to walk the 20 miles. So he got up and he left his home at midnight, and he walked all night. I'm leaving some details out that are truly endearing, so you'd have to go and find it, just for the sake of time here. The house where he was going to be working was owned by a white couple. When this young man showed up very early that morning, the woman of the house was so moved and impressed by this young man's story, because she asked him why he was there so early, and he told her, that she actually invited him. She invited him into her house and actually said, well, you can go upstairs and take a rest so that when your fellow workers come, you'll be rested and ready to work. Which just blew Steve Harvey away. This young man declined and said he wanted to get started before the other workers showed up. Long story short, obviously this woman said something, or his fellow workers said something, because the CEO of the company heard about this and was so impressed by this young man, he actually bought him a car. CEO doesn't know this kid from Adam, so to speak, if there's another Adam here, sorry. But he doesn't know this kid from Adam, but he's so impressed that he buys him a car. And someone started, this woman, woman of the house, started a GoMe fund, wanted to raise $2,000, raised $90,000, and the young man gave $25,000 of that to a scholarship fund that he had been a part of in high school. It's just paying forward all the time. Just keeps going. It's like somebody had to write the script. No, it's actually real life. And so many other good things happened to him. So why am I telling this? Steve Harvey said, we have to tell these stories because it's real and so good on so many levels that I can't even go into for time's sake. He said, we have to tell these stories because we hear so many bad stories. This is such a good, true, real story. Life can be changed by an invitation extended to another person. If that woman had not invited a stranger into her home, the story might have ended there. We really don't know. And Steve Harvey said to this young man, none of this just happens for nothing. This has happened for a reason. This has happened, and he goes on and he encourages this man, almost mentors him on the spot, to keep this going. Don't forget what's happened to you. This has been for a purpose. He actually brings God into it. It can be difficult to welcome somebody and invite someone, but if you ask the Holy Spirit to help you, a life can be changed. Our Father Richard cannot invite everyone to Alpha. Each one of you in your circle of influence can. Just think of how many people are here and multiply the circle of influence, all those people in your circle of influence. You're being called to live out your version of who would you invite to dinner. Just as the Pharisees forgot their own corporate history, all we have to do is remind ourselves of the first reading and see how depraved the children of Israel had become. And as a result of this, forgetting this, they basically began to distance themselves from those people, when in fact they were those people. So we can forget our own personal history of how God has shown mercy to us so many times, and how many times he has invited us back into communion with himself. And many times we just push him away, don't accept the invitation, put off the confession. When we forget how we've been invited and welcomed into God's life, then we can just live our lives in our own enclosed circle. If we keep a lived sense of God's mercy in our life, how God invites us continuously to follow him, then we will find all the incentive we need to invite others. We are all challenged to think about, who do I want to invite to come to Alpha? It could very well be that person you think will not accept the invitation, but who at the same time you think might be open to something better, something more complete in their lives. But both you and they will never know unless you invite them. Remember this, it's not your job to make someone come to Alpha. If you do not succeed or fail, if someone does accept the invite or doesn't accept the invite, you succeed, your success is in extending a genuine, sincere invitation to someone to come to dinner, to Alpha. That is the success. It's kind of like what John Wooden used to say to the UCLA basketball players. He said, don't think of winning the game. And this is true. Don't think of winning the game. Think of the practice today, of doing your best in the practice. The winning will come on its own. Don't think of winning. Think of what you're supposed to do. And it's the same kind of formula. My success is not in do they come or not, but is in the invitation. Sincere, genuine invitation. Jesus invited Matthew. To everyone's surprise, Matthew actually accepted. Remember, Jesus will help you extend the invitation. It's up to the person to accept. Remember Peter Lee's testimony last week about Bob from Nova Scotia. Somebody invited him 7 times, and Bob finally accepted. His life was and continues to be radically changed, and now Bob becomes the inviter. Each one of us should ask ourselves, so I invite you to ask yourself, who are the 3 people I would invite to dinner? When you come up with those 3 people, then pray. Ask the Holy Spirit to help you, and then invite them to Alpha.